We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Detol Banega Swast India. Presenting now, Crossroads, Jonathan Franzen in conversation with Anindita Ghose. Award-winning novelist and essayist Jonathan Franzen is celebrated for his roster of vivid characters and thoughtful examination of the condition of contemporary America. Crossroads, however, is the first in a trilogy intended to depict three generations of shifting cultures. Beginning in the early 70s, it is the story of a midwestern family in the middle of a historical movement of moral crisis. Franzen joins writer Anindita Ghose for a conversation about his vivid portrayal of the political and social crosscurrents of the last 50 years in America and a family in the midst. Jonathan Franzen is the author of 5 novels, Purity, Freedom, The Corrections, The 27th City, and Strong Motion, and 5 works of nonfiction and translation, including Further Away, How to Be Alone, and The Discomfort Zone. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the German Akademie der Kunste, and the French Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Anindita Ghose is an author and journalist based in Mumbai. Her debut novel, The Illuminated, published to critical acclaim in 2021, is a bestseller. Ghose is a graduate of Columbia's journalism school and was previously the editor of the Saturday magazine Mint Lounge and features director of Vogue India. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Do please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Lit Fest. Ladies and gentlemen, Crossroads, Jonathan Franzen in conversation with Anindita Ghose.
Hi, Jonathan, and thanks for leaving what I hope was an exciting poker game to join us for this session. I'm going to make the safe assumption that everybody listening in already knows everything there is to know about you in the public domain, including the provocative things you may or may not have said. So I'm going to jump straight to the questions because I just finished reading Crossroads, as you know, and I have a lot of them. I don't know if I can cover all of it in 40 minutes, but let's try. So first, when did you know this was going to be a trilogy? Was it more a matter of not being able to cover all the ground in one volume, or was it more of a formal decision to kind of show generational patterns over 3 volumes?
First of all, it's great to be here with you, and I would, of course, have loved to come to Jaipur in person, but this is a tough year for that. So it's great talking to you at this distance. It's evening in Santa Cruz, it's morning in India, and that feels right. The trilogy. The trilogy, yeah, it was a matter of my planning a book with 3 parts and then the first part getting out of hand. And it got out of hand because it was just taking me much longer to move through the story than I thought it would. I didn't exactly know where the story was going, and I was discovering it as I went along, and I was just happy to be there in 1971. It was a time I knew well. It was a formative year in my childhood, important year, and then what do you do with the other 2 parts of the book? Well, then you go to your publisher and say, oh, there are going to be 3 books, not 1, and that's kind of how it happened. But also, I mean, honestly, at this point in my life, I don't know how many books I have in me, and the statistics aren't really very good about the number of really good books that any writer can write. And I would have, if I'd written a single volume, then I would have faced the problem of inventing something entirely from scratch at an age where that becomes difficult. So instead, I'm kind of doing a Ferrante.
Okay, but you did mention, I mean, when we kind of spoke earlier, that writing each volume or working for each volume will kind of be an entirely, you do kind of have to start from scratch because you want to avoid formal repetitions. So it's not really a matter of convenience.
As it turns out, no, although I was blissfully or willfully ignorant of that when I proposed the trilogy. It was only this past spring when I set about thinking about the next volume that I realized, yeah, it's not a sequel. It has to be its own book. I don't want to just have the continued adventures and, you know, for each of the main characters we've met, oh, think of a new problem for them. And then, of course, there are obstacles, and it becomes very mechanical in a way. And it is the burden I carry as a writer to hate repeating myself, hate doing the kind of book I've done before. So, yeah, what I'd hoped would be economies of scale have not materialized yet.
Right. So you mentioned you hate repeating yourself, but you know the idea of repetition is so much spoken about, especially in the realm of painting. Cézanne spoke about every time he painted the Mont Saint Victoire, he was getting closer to the mountain or learning something new about it. I think Crossroads is your sixth book, and I think it's safe to say, in say 4 out of your 6 books, there are certain familial tropes, which I think, you know, has been much discussed in all your reviews and all the commentary around your book, so I won't go into repeating them. But do you think that approaching those tropes or working with those tropes repeatedly is getting you closer to some kind of truth, is getting you closer to, like Cézanne, to some kind of an ending or some, you know, is it getting you closer to something, basically, is what I'm asking.
I don't know about that. I think I'm getting closer to writing the kind of book that I was meant to write. It took me 40 years of being a novelist to reach a point where I felt like I was doing the thing the way the real me would do it. And when you're young, you're posturing. I had a lot to prove with my early novels. I was trying to show off. I had some somewhat misguided notions of the social role of the novelist, imagining that my books could actually significantly change the world. And it has been a slow process of letting go of those things to reach a point where I feel I'm doing exactly what I want to do. The repetitions, well, first of all, I wanted finally to write a family novel, and the original conception was for one single book, but with 3 parts, and it would span 50 years. And I wanted to do that because when you talk about families, we are the product of our genetics and our environment. And of course, in a family, much of what constitutes the environment is our close genetic relatives have made an environment for us. But to really understand what's going on, I think in a family, you can't just take a snapshot at a moment in time or even a couple of years. The repetition of the patterns becomes itself very, very, very important. So I've now had to reconcile myself with doing a certain amount of repetition of the tropes you speak of.
Right. You mentioned you finally wanted to write a family novel, and I heard you say this in, I think, previous interviews, but you do know that most of us think of Corrections and Freedom as family novels, maybe Strong Motion in some way, but definitely Corrections and Freedom, they were the kind of big American family novels. So I'm curious as to what you think is different in Crossroads that makes it a true family novel and makes those novels about other things.
So Crossroads, much of the book takes place on a single evening,
Right.
Afternoon and evening in December of 1971. I don't know, it's like 400 pages devoted to that one 12-hour period. And in those 400 pages, there's very little that doesn't consist of scenes between members of the family. So I had had families, yes, in the corrections, a book that's fairly well known. But that is a family that's kind of gone like that. We get the parents together, and we get the oldest son, Gary, with his wife and kids. But we see actually remarkably little of how that family actually interacts with each other, the individuals in the family. And that was a very deliberate kind of explosion of the family, specifically the three kids going to the East Coast of the United States, parents remaining in the old-fashioned Midwest. And the jobs, the very jobs of the kids were designed to illuminate different aspects of contemporary America. And because that was actually more interesting to me, that was more important to me, the family became simply this inescapable organizing principle. Yes, well, we have these parents, and the parents are falling apart, and we have my brother who's completely irresponsible, and we have my other brother who's an asshole. But to my mind, reading that book, it doesn't feel like, Buddenbrooks, where you just are there in the house, chapter after chapter with the family.
Right. Okay. Okay. So the New York Times has called Crossroads a mellow, marzipan-hued 70s era heartbreaker. And I do agree, it's very sympathetic to its characters, even when the characters themselves believe they are faulty, or in Marion's case, she truly believes she's a sinner. You've been talking a lot about kindness lately, and I'm curious if there's been, a brand shift in the kind of cult of Jonathan Franzen. If are you no longer the angry male novelist you were supposed to be? Do you feel a shift?
I can't control what people make of me. I don't actually think. Well, okay. First of all, I will cop to having been quite angry in past decades, and the corrections in particular. There's an anger in that book, and it engenders a lot of the harsher comedy. A lot of good comedy is driven by rage, and but some of the Jonathan Franzen hates this and hates that. Whatever. I can't control that. I think the fundamental sympathy I have for my main characters. I don't think I've been mean to any of my main characters since maybe I was a little bit mean in the first novel, but I'm mostly not a mean person or a mean writer. The kindness thing has come out of this country I'm living in, where people seem to have lost the capacity to be kind at the most basic level to one another. It's become a very rage-filled country, and I think if I talk about kindness, it's mostly in relation to that American reality we're now living in. Although I do also have to mention, in my experience, marzipan is white.
Sometimes it's colored, in pastel colors. So I think maybe
okay,
that's what he meant, or maybe because it's not pure white. It's kind of an eggshell, like there's a yellowish tone. So I think maybe the writer wanted to say sepia toned. I don't know why he said marzipan.
Well, sepia might have been like more turn of the 20th century, like 100 years old. But it's that the cover image on most of the editions of Crossroads is a somewhat yellowed photo from my own my own store of photos. Those are two friends of mine on the cover, and maybe that's what he meant. Yes.
Okay.
And yellow doesn't sound as kind as marzipan hued. We need not go further with this.
Okay. You've called yourself a novelist of character, And apart from, I'm presently reading The 27th City, and this has some pretty far out characters. But apart from this book, your characters have largely been ordinary people. They are never sociopaths or rapists or murderers. They're ordinary people with, I guess, mundane flaws. There are sociopaths and murderers. I've missed them.
I think Andreas Wolff in Purity is kind of sociopath, actually.
I guess.
But broadly speaking, yes, I write about non-insane people.
Right. So, but I was wondering what makes a Jonathan Franzen character, and who was the hardest to write in Crossroads, where there's a vast array, father, mother, 4 kids. I think the youngest son is kind of the least developed, but probably the easiest to love. I'm sure he's everybody's favorite so far. But who was the hardest to write, and what makes a character a Jonathan Franzen character, simply because they seem so ordinary?
Well, let's see. There are 2 questions there. Hardest to write. I found the daughter in Crossroads the hardest to write because she is a pretty and very, very popular 18-year-old, and it's kind of hard to have sympathy for people who got it all in that way. There are a couple of kids, a couple female, a couple male in every high school class, and they're the really popular ones, and they're usually kind of good looking, and everyone else kind of hates them. While also adulating them. I was an alienated teenager, so I wasn't a big fan of the cheerleaders or their scene, and so it was hard to like Becky, and I felt it might be hard for a reader to like Becky too. So a lot of work went into that. What makes a Jonathan Franzen character? It seems kind of mechanical. They tend to want something or need something urgently, and they are not all good or all bad. I would say that probably a statistically significant percentage of my characters are concerned about whether or not they're a good person. So that kind of moral self-consciousness may be a bit of a marker.
Right. I actually found Becky quite likable, and also because I think in the book, more than any of the other characters, she's the one who's grappling with this idea of goodness and whether her goodness is real or whether it's posturing. Perry talks a lot about it, but I think Becky's actually living it. So I had a lot of sympathy for her character, actually. Maybe I'm in the minority, I don't know. But for me, it was quite hard to pick because the chapters are written in alternating voices. I've realized when that happens in a book, I usually have one character I like, and then you kind of just want to speed through the other, other chapters because you want to get to that person. But that didn't happen to me with Crossroads. I felt all the characters and their tracks were kind of quite interestingly developed. But yeah, Becky was quite interesting to me, actually. So, yeah.
Well, I just have to tell you, from the very beginning, the very first people who read the book, editor, agent, people have felt obliged to tell me who their favorite character was. And also in many cases who their least favorite character was. And I have to tell you, every 4 of the 5 main characters have received votes as favorite character from friends and acquaintances, and also just readers I don't even know but who write to me. The one who has not received any votes as favorite character is Becky.
Look, I don't know if I'm voting for her, but I'm saying she's not as hard to like as you.
Well, I worked hard to create some sympathy for her. I gave her a problem,
But
and I gave her failings, and um, just because you're pretty and popular and the whole world revolves around you doesn't mean you don't have feelings. So,
But what I think is interesting is I think the people who voted, their votes might change in 10 years. I'm sure mine might. And I think that's what's very interesting. I think depending on where you are, in your age and station and kind of place in life at the moment that you read the book, you might have a different favorite character and that might change later. So I
yeah,
think that quite interesting.
it really tells me something when someone says Russ is their favorite character, and a number of people have, and Russ is Russ is ridiculous.
No, I actually felt the most sympathy for him. I did feel sympathy for Russ because I really felt bad for him because I feel there are too many Russes around us.
I
And
know.
it's good to know the interiority of a Russ character and understand what is so troubled about them.
Just to quickly fill in case anyone is watching who hasn't read the book, Russ is a pastor in a church, a liberal Christian church, and he's very concerned about having lost his edge. Young people can't relate to him anymore, and he's in the process of seriously acting out by trying to start something with one of his female parishioners. So he's, it's not a pretty picture, but kind of a funny
So
one.
changing his style, he pulls out this old stylish sheepskin coat, right? So he's really trying to.
I know he really is. He's tried so hard.
Yeah. But so while on characters, for a novelist of character, I'm surprised that you've never attempted the first person voice in writing, and it quite seems to be a literary fiction trend for a few years now. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are, and if you're just generally against trends, and that's why you haven't written in first person.
Well, I am generally against trends. I mean, it's kind of your job to be original and look where people aren't looking and to do things that people aren't doing. But that's not the basis of my opposition to the first person. That's a very old opposition. I did have one long chapter in Purity that is in the first person. It's a manuscript. It's an unpublished memoir by one of the characters, and it is hands down the hardest thing I ever wrote. It nearly killed me writing that chapter in first person. I once taught an undergraduate writing workshop for a semester. Actually, I did it twice. And I came in, and this is a long time ago, so it tells you how old my opposition is, and said, let's think about writing in third person. And the students informed me that the teacher who had taught the workshop the previous year had said, well, you must start writing in first person. Then maybe you can try third person. And it's like, no, that's terrible advice. So why am I opposed to it? I mean, occasionally it works. You wouldn't want Humbert to be told in third person. You want him to be speaking in his inimitable voice, his very Nabokovian voice, as it happens. You wouldn't want The Great Gatsby without the kind, midwestern, sensible, bemused Nick Carraway helping us through it. But those are exceptions when you have that really, really pitch perfect voice that the book can't do without. In general, third person is a much, much more supple and multidimensional voice because You can get super close to a character. You can be right inside their head in third person, and then in the same sentence, you can be describing the room, and you can be describing the weather, and then by the end of the long sentence, you're right back in that person's head, and it's all seamless. It's what we expect. It's the natural way that stories are told. It's just like this wonderful camera that can pull out and pull in and pull out and pull in. Tonally, it's so much richer in possibility. With first person, I'm always thinking, well, okay, you wrote all this down, did you? I mean, Nabokov in Lolita, it's great. It's clear that he's in prison and he's writing this to try to explain himself. I don't remember exactly what the frame is, but I think there's even a legal dimension to the fact that he's created this document. I'm always wondering who created this document, and then it becomes really weird when there are multiple voices with different characters all speaking in an I in a book, and it's like, well, who wrote this down? It's with third person, it's implicit. An author is telling you this story, and you know that and you accept that. Like when you're 2 sentences into it, it's like, okay, Franzen's telling me a story, or some narrator who might as well be Franzen is telling me the story. All these things, and like, how do you describe what the main character looks like if the main character is doing an I? It's like, oh, I walked over to the mirror and I saw, it's like. And I was, I had medium length blonde hair and an old scar from a paring knife accident. It's like, really, it's so hard. Whereas with third person, you just like describe the face, and it's completely invisible. If we completely accept that, it just like disappears.
I guess if the character is very self-absorbed, it works. I felt one newish book that the first person was really good in was Otessa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I can't imagine that book not being told in first person. But I've just been very curious about this. I haven't done an MFA, I haven't studied writing formally, but all the new books seem to have this first person voice, and it seems to be the new thing in literature. So it's just been very confusing to me. The books I read growing up never had the first person voice.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of a larger cultural trend, I think. And you're kind of on safe ground. If the main character is a whole lot like the author and speaking in the author's own voice, then you're kind of safe from questions of cultural appropriation. What are you doing as a man writing about a woman, vice versa? All of that stuff. It's that kind of first person testimony is politically safe in a way.
Since you spoke about cultural appropriation, it's a question I wanted to get to later, but I can ask it now. I read interviews in which you've said you haven't written about race because you don't have very many Black friends. I don't know if you've been misquoted, but it also said that you haven't been in love with a Black woman, and that's why you haven't written Black characters.
I was misquoted.
Okay.
Now it wasn't misquoted. I was quoted accurately. It was someone made that interpretation. I did not say that.
Right. I find this, though, somewhat related. I mean, there are questions of cultural appropriation in literature now, and I find it somewhat related to this issue in the movie business now, which is about should a trans character only be played by a trans actor, or should a gay character be only played by a gay actor? Should a Chinese actor play a Japanese character? There's all of this happening, and I wonder, isn't it a writer's job or an actor's job to research, to use their imagination and write about whatever they want to write about, as long as, I'm sure there's a whole vetting process. Somebody can just vet it for cultural inaccuracy, or isn't it an actor's job to actually just inhabit whatever role they're given and act? What are your thoughts on this?
What's happening in Hollywood now, I think, is a little different. when you have available a lot of really fine Native American actors, and you instead cast somebody who, you know, happens to look Indian but is in fact Italian American and has been in the country for generations, it does raise the question, well, why aren't you acknowledging this pool of talent with people who could actually play the role from their own experience? And historically, there has been a lot of that. Historically, it has not been an easy road for actors of color, actors of different sexual orientation in Hollywood. So that's a separate question. But yes, I think unless you are writing pure autofiction, you are always, to some extent, appropriating somebody. One wouldn't want to take that right away from the writer, because part of what you're supposed to be doing in literature is imagining what it's like to not be yourself, and that goes, of course, for the reader. You're imagining what it's like to be female if you're a male reader reading a book, and I think to make the attempt to understand what it's like to be someone else, that if there's a moral dimension to literature, if there's a potentially socially useful benefit to literature, it has to do with that capacity for empathy, that wish to imagine what it's like not to be you or like you. But you have to be careful, obviously, and I'm glad you brought up that mischaracterization of what I said. What I said was, it becomes easier to write about someone very different from yourself in a different group, say a Black American for a white American, if you have known someone really, really well, if you've loved a person, if you've lived with a person. I think, and that's why I'm unapologetic about rendering female subjectivity in my work, because I've lived with women all my life. In fact, I've mostly lived with women. My father was gone. My brothers were gone when I was growing up. It was just me and my mom, year after year. Mostly it was just me and my mom. Like if I don't, and I love my mom. So if I don't know what it's like, just from trying to be in a relationship with her, what it might like to be like to be her, then I don't know what anything is like. But it's harder if someone has had a completely different experience of the world. And I think women have a different experience of the world than men do. And so I think if you've never met a woman or never really loved a woman, never spent time with one in a serious way, then it might actually be hard to understand what that experience is. And that very much goes for the Black American experience, which we're in the process, belatedly, of really, really coming to terms, white Americans, with how little we know about what it's really like to be Black in this country. And, it's a sorrow of mine that I have never had a close Black friend. I've never really loved someone that way. So I just feel like it's so, out of respect for the difference of that experience, I would tread very, very carefully in writing from the point of view of a Black American.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. I feel, as somebody who's just written my first book, it feels really scary. It's very scary to think that a writer is expected to, preempt or think so much about what's okay or not okay. I've been reading a lot of reviews lately also, because I have a book out. I'm just trying to understand review culture. And
Are you reading your own reviews of your own work?
No, I'm just reading reviews in general. I have read some reviews of my work, but I don't anymore because I don't feel that it's helping me in any way, and I want to write the next book.
Good.
Okay. But I do find increasingly that a lot of fiction is being reviewed or written about as nonfiction. It happened to, a review of my book as well, but then I see it as a larger trend. As in, reviewers are responding not to text or to the interiority of a character or the truth of a character, but to ideologies in the book or a philosophy in a book that they don't agree with personally. What would and of course, readers are influenced and shaped by reviews to an extent. What would your advice be to young readers approaching fiction in this highly politicized time, or approaching fiction in the age of Twitter? How does a young reader? They will read reviews. You can't tell them not to read reviews. I think there is a role of reviews out there. But what would your advice to a young reader be, basically, to make up their own mind, or how should they interpret a review?
That's a new question. I haven't thought about that.
But do you agree with what I'm saying about fiction being reviewed as nonfiction, as in people responding to, not to it as fiction, but about, certain ideologies in the book, and then responding to it as if it's an essay or as if it's an opinion column when it's fiction?
Well, one has a right to do that, academic literary critics would be out of business if they were not allowed to read against the grain that way. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing if they were out of business, but nevertheless, it's going to happen. I think, to me, it takes the fun out of literature. If everything has to pass through the processor of politics. Obviously, there is such a thing as an offensive book. And I think, for example, cultural appropriation. If someone has done it badly, if someone has written about an other in a sentimental way or a simplistic way or a completely wrong-headed way, I think it's absolutely appropriate for a reviewer to call them out on that. Different matter if you get called out, no matter how well you do it. That's unfortunate, but that's going to happen. But I no longer really read reviews at all, book reviews at all, except when it's a friend and they've gotten an exceptionally good review and I'm happy for them and I want to see what was said. But by and large, when I read reviews, my question was, is this book going to be fun? Am I going to enjoy reading this? And you can tell by the sentences quoted, oh, God, that's a great line. That's an amazing paragraph. Or this just sounds like a really enjoyable book to read. I'm just speaking off the top of my head, but to me, that's what you should be looking for as a reader in a review is a sense of, are you going to enjoy reading this book? Because I, for one, my primary aim is to create a book that is enjoyable to read. Everything else is secondary. I want you to have fun reading it. I want you to get involved with it and be sorry when it's over. And I think that is still a useful measure. And a good reviewer and a good review will give you a sense of whether this is a book that you're going to get into.
Right. Okay. Because we don't have too much time, I want to come back to Crossroads. I didn't do a very good job of outlining the book at the start of the session because I just assume everybody has read it by now, or they should, and they can read the synopsis online. But very quickly, since it is divided into chapters devoted to each character, and the chapters that are about, so there's Clem, who's the eldest son, there's Becky, who's the cheerleader that Jonathan spoke about earlier, then there's Perry, who's high IQ, high functioning drug addict, and then there's Judson, who's the youngest son, who doesn't have his own chapters, and then there are the parents, Russ and Marion. So, Jonathan, while reading the book, especially in Perry's chapters, it's very clear because of the vocabulary and the kind of tempo that there is a sensorial world of this high IQ drug addict, right? The chapters are told, it's very frenzied language when he's high. But I was curious about how much time you spent building different sensorial worlds for each of the characters. I read an essay in the New Yorker by Akhil Sharma. I know he's an author we've discussed in the past, and he wrote in that essay that he used only 2 senses in family life. And I had loved the book when I'd read it, but after I read him say that, I reread the book and it kind of made a lot of sense, and there was a specific reason he did it. So I wondered if, in writing from about 5 characters, if you were very consciously trying to build different sensorial worlds for each of them?
Yeah, I mean, so it takes me a long time to develop a character, and finally I figure out what it is that they want and what their problem is. I'm aided writing a family novel by the fact that siblings tend to differentiate themselves against one another. If you're not going to have 2 specialists in one way of being. Some siblings like to each have their little piece of parental attention, and they have very, very different ways of getting it, and very, very different ways of defining themselves. So that helps. But in the case of Perry, for example, I was thinking of somebody I knew in high school, so I could see him, I could hear him, I could hear his kind of top of the throat, pompous way of speaking, and because he had a large vocabulary, because I have a large vocabulary, those were relatively easy chapters to write. I could just let loose. There was no degree of intellectual content that I couldn't pursue, because I'd already posited, well, he's a genius 15-year-old. But it's a matter of sitting with the character and what they want, and then trying to write sentences, and the first chapter about a character starts happening when I can hear in the sentence, oh, this doesn't sound like the other chapters. This is there's something else, there's something new going on here. So I think most of that, sensorium is an interesting word, and I didn't know that about Akhil's book. I hadn't heard that he'd said that. Now I want to go back and look for that.
He said he used audio and visual, and that made a lot of sense to me. That's why the book is a very fast read.
Yep. It's a dynamite book. Anyone out there who hasn't read it, check it out. Actually, both of his novels are dynamite novels. But for me, it's more about listening to what the sentences are telling me, and trying until I can hear this is a character. Okay. I don't know if it sounds stupid, but
No, it doesn't. So I have 2 quick questions, and I really want to cover them before we end. One, that in your own words, you've said you have the perfect record of failing to put your novels on screen, but Crossroads is being developed. There was a big news announcement for TV. And I remember reading that Daniel Craig was supposed to star in the Purity movie, and then he decided to do the James Bond film, which isn't a very good film, so he shouldn't have done it. And that's why that fell through. But what is the attraction for you, to be involved in a screen adaptation? And you've tried writing a screenplay yourself also.
Well, no, I wrote more than half of the 20 episodes of Purity, and I wrote most of the first season of The Corrections way back 10 years ago when HBO was trying to do it. The attraction is money. You get paid for this. and you get very good health insurance if you're a screenwriter. So I didn't have a good experience with the corrections. I had a wonderful experience with purity. It was partly that Daniel was very, very involved. He was in the room for months with us, and very much part of creating the show. But that's the only chance I have in my life to really work as a member of a team.
Right.
Where people are counting on me. I said I'd have this hour done by Friday, and I'm going to do whatever it takes on Thursday night to make sure I deliver that. And the way story is developed in a room, the way the conversation goes, the way we bounce ideas off each other, and come up with great stuff. It's just fun. So I think that fun and money are the two attractants.
Right. But do you think having the novelist in the room, kind of changes the dynamic of the room? Does it limit the other writers' contribution because they feel, hey, he knows best because he created the world?
Not if you've got the right people in the room. And there was a little old me, and then there's Daniel Craig. It's like, he's got an opinion. People are going to listen to it. And Todd Field, who is the director and the other main writer, he's not going to back down from anyone. So no, I actually think I'm a valuable resource. I know the characters, and the writing is easier for me because I know all the voices. But no, I don't think there's any particular privilege that I was aware of.
Okay. And Jonathan, since this is, primarily for an Indian audience, I mean, now GLF is global and I hope many others are listening in, but because it is for an Indian audience, I have to talk about the 27th city. And, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you why, what your fascination with Indian women is, because you earlier mentioned you don't write about characters that you haven't lived with or know very well. You have Indian women recurring. I mean, there are 3 or more in this. There's an Indian woman in Freedom, small character, but very important. Just, for your first book, how did you come upon this really wacky concept? I mean, I feel I'm just really curious. It's a really wacky book. I'm having a lot of fun reading it, but just tell me about Jammu, the cop from India, who's your hero.
Anindita, this is our second interview, and I've done a number of other interviews with and for Indian media, and I've never actually been asked this question, and part of me has kind of dreaded it. Talk about cultural appropriation. Wow. There's a story there. I can tell you the story. So the first thing I ever published was co-written with a friend in high school. It was a play, and we actually got it published when I was 17. We got the letter of acceptance, and so I thought, okay, I'm going to be a playwright. And I did love the theater, like a lot of people in high school do. And so this one summer, my co-writer Kathy and a friend of ours, Nick, decided we're going to write a 3-act farce, an original 3-act farce. And it happened that Nick had been reading a lot of kind of crappy novels about Englishmen in India in colonial times. Ridiculous, stupid British people. And we thought, well, that could be fun. Well, let's do a murder mystery set in British colonial India. And let's have the Indian character, the police inspector, be like so much smarter than any of these stupid doltish Brits. This will be fun. So we did, and it was terrible, but it was long, and we worked all summer on it. And then I took a playwriting workshop. The one writing workshop I ever took was a playwriting workshop in college. And we had to come up with 10 new pages every week. And after about 5 weeks, I was out of material. And so I just had this idea, let me take that Indian police inspector and put him, it was a him at the time, put him in my parents' kitchen. And really, and it was only 10 pages, and I put them in a drawer, but the 3 other people in the workshop said, well, this is really kind of weird and fun. And when I decided, no, I don't want to be a playwright, I want to be a novelist, well, that was what was in the drawer, and that's kind of where it came from. And at a certain point, I realized, well, let's make that police inspector a woman. That's the book is nominally about India. I tried with, pre-internet, reading a lot of books. I read all of Ved Mehta, for example. I tried to acquaint myself with Indian culture in the 20th century, but it's really a book about me and my wife, honestly. And the book kind of embarrasses me at this point slightly. It's a remarkable thing for a 25-year-old to have written, and yet overhanging it all is the ridiculous idea that suddenly some very, very smart people from India, I don't even know what kind of visas they're on. They're all there with this vast conspiracy to take over my hometown. That's the story of the book, and it's I did my best with what was really fundamentally a ridiculous idea. In the course of it all, I did get to, I was steeped in the history and culture of India, really going back to the Mughals, and that's why it was really fun to finally come to Jaipur, whatever it was, 6 years ago, because I'd written a whole novel about Indians, and I'd never been to India.
I don't even know Indian fiction that kind of covers Indira Gandhi's assassination and uses that as a, takeoff point. So it's really interesting. And I would urge, people listening into this to read 27th City, maybe after Crossroads. I think it's very interesting to read a novelist's first book. Because, there's something Dorian Gray about it. There's something of their soul that's captured in that first book. So, I find first books pretty fascinating. And Jonathan, I wish we could go on, but I think we do have to wrap up. So thank you so much for joining us from Santa Cruz, from your kitchen, on a Sunday evening. And I really enjoyed speaking with you. And I'm really looking forward to book 2. So I hope we can get that, and you're not too distracted by screen adaptations or books of essays. Please write book 2 soon. That's my parting request.
Thanks, but no pressure, right?
No pressure at all.
No pressure.
You'll just have a lot of fan mail, every month asking you, hey, what's up? You need to,
it's been a real pleasure. And thanks to the festival for letting us have this conversation. And, next time in Jaipur itself.
Thank you, Jonathan Franzen and Anindita Ghose, for that insightful session. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Sessions are ongoing across all our 3 venues, the Front Lawn, Mughal Tent, and the Darbar Hall. Please do stay tuned in for the next session. And now presenting a JLF Writer Shorts.